This podcast is a member of the Place to Be Nation family. Visit us at placetobenation.com.
And sadly, even though we have a great topic tonight, unfortunately, this is one of those months where a great topic came from tragedy, unfortunately. But we will do our best. Welcome to the May edition of Through the Looking Glass. I am your co-host, Scott Criscuolo. Joining me, as always, a guy who never makes me not smile, even when it's a sad episode, because he's got an infectious smile, folks, if you've never seen it. And he brings the goods. Good mood, bad mood, he brings the goods. He is the Thunder from Down Under. Hello, Dave Hall. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Scott. I'm doing well. I've got a smile on my face considering that it has been miserable weather-wise for about a week down here where I live in Australia. So it's just been
really?
one of those ongoing rain and, just that, ongoing rain, wet weather, the high winds. It's just, hasn't been fun. But there's always something to smile about. So my youngest son just had his 16th birthday yesterday.
God bless him. That's awesome.
Yeah, so we have a lovely weekend celebrating that.
Good. That's fantastic. Good. The weather here in the Northeast the last week is in Northeast United States has not been that bad. It was nice the last couple days. We've had a lot of rain the last few weeks in my neck of the woods in New England and the Northeast. So I don't want to hear about droughts from the news people over throughout the summer, because we've gotten a ton of rain. So all the reservoirs should be fairly full. I don't want to hear it. Anyway, always a pleasure. What I love, Dave, and we always have fun with this. We've had fun throughout the few years, the 3+ years we've done the show, is that we always make fun of, obviously, for those that may not know, in Australia, their seasons are the opposite of ours. In other words, he's in winter right now. Or he's in fall, actually going into winter.
Just going into winter.
Yeah, he's in the fall going into winter. Of course, we're in the spring going into summer. But his winters are like our falls, and his summers are like our summers. But he does not get the winters we get here. So, for instance, what was the temp today, Dave?
Oh, what are we? It's about 20 degrees Celsius. I can never remember.
Right, so that's probably that would probably be 0 degrees Celsius is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's freezing. So if doing that kind of math, so it was for Fahrenheit, it was in the low 50s, which isn't bad.
68 according to
68. Holy crap! Well, so you're in the fall, and you were only 6 degrees cooler than we were. We tapped out my area of the woods, 7 degrees. We tapped out at about 75 today. But when we do our January episode, Dave, it's going to be like 99 degrees.
That's right.
And then up here, you could knock one of those 9s off, and it'll be 9 degrees here. So I'd rather have your winters. Anyway, Dave, always a pleasure. I love getting together with you every month, talking about journeys unfulfilled, uncharted. And again, as I mentioned at the top, sadly, our topic tonight comes from tragedy. It is an obit episode per se. Of course, we lost a legend of the business this past week, and that is the homicidal, genocidal Sabu, who passed away. I didn't see his age. I don't have it in front of me. I'm guessing mid-60s, I think, probably, right? Do you have his age in front of you, Dave?
Just grabbing
his age
now.
I think he was in his mid-60s. I can't open up
he was 60, dead on 60. He was born May 11, 2025, so he's only just turned 60.
So he just turned 60 years old. Obviously an icon of the business throughout the 1990s. He was, the face of ECW, one of the face. Well, I shouldn't say the face. He was one of the faces of ECW. We'll talk about matches obviously throughout the evening. But I have one particular match that's one of my favorites, and I feel like I live watched it at some point on an episode of something here on the PTB Wrestling Network. I don't remember where, but I'll tell you that match in a little while when we get to that. But he was an enigma. He was an odd guy. He was an odd guy for the business. Of course, he was the nephew of the original Sheik, Eddie Farhat, not the Iron Sheik, the original Sheik, who of course dominated. What was it? Big time wrestling up in the up in the Detroit area for years in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, probably into the early 80s too. And he was the master of sticking pencils and forks and other, anything that Abdul the Butcher used in the 80s and 90s. Eddie Farhat, the original Sheik, used in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. And he is Sabu's nephew. And of course, he was very close with Rob Van Dam as well. He was an interesting guy. A lot of people consider him a modern day version of like a Bruiser Brody or a Stan Hansen. He was always looking for his next pick of the spinach, if you will, meaning his next paycheck. So he was a kind of a flaky guy. And I think he was a guy that a lot of people may not have trusted much. And we're going to talk about that tonight. Because we go through the looking glass and talk about, Sabu and why he maybe never thrived in or did a lot for WCW or for the WWE. There's a lot of reasons why, but what would have happened if he was? But I think a lot of it, of course, was trust and such. We'll talk about a couple of his best matches and what matches he could have had with guys had he been in certain places. So I'll ask you first, Dave, and then I'll answer. What are your, before we get into before we go through the journey, tell me your exposure to Sabu. Because again, we've talked about this in the past when it's come to other stuff. You obviously, in your neck of the woods, didn't have as much visibility for stuff outside of, say, WWE or even NWA/WCW. So, and I think you've mentioned in the past when you got ECW, but when was your first exposure to maybe Sabu specifically and that part of wrestling in the 90s, like ECW, and when did you get exposed to that?
Well, my early exposure to both ECW and Sabu came through the Aptamags.
Gotcha.
As I've shared before, we predominantly only got WWF television superstars. We got the Coliseum videos, and we got at times, and predominantly from sort of 95 on, we started getting WCW stuff, although there'd been some videos available earlier. So ECW was not on our television. We didn't have access to it. So my first exposure was the Aptamags, and they did multiple stories on him and on the role he was playing in wrestling at the time. You got a few feature stories, plus you always got like Bill Apter's ringside sections and little updates, and the ratings section always gave you the ongoing updates. So that was my primary early exposure. And then in sort of late 95 into 96, we started to get just a couple of the ECW VHS releases. They released some of the shows on VHS generically. I think Hostile City Showdown's one I remember was available. It was only like 6 or 7 of them that ever got released in Australia. So they were all that time period, that 95 time period. So 94, 95 videos. So that's, I managed to get my hands on a couple of those, but again, they were very, very difficult to come by. You had to borrow them from the right video store, and you had to hope the video store had them. So there might be 10 video stores in the area. One might have 2 or 3 of the VHSs, and that's really all it was. So not a lot of exposure until later on. And then clearly as the DVD phenomenon grew, that definitely made it a lot easier to get my hands on some of his work. So seeing the ECW DVDs that were released, both by ECW at the back end of their run, and also Rise and Fall of ECW, Bloodsport, those sorts of DVDs that were released, and the matches that were on them. And then And then in more recent years, with access to the network and other opportunities, with everything being available now, being able to go back and watch some stuff, I've been able to do that. So yeah, but predominantly early days, it was Pro Wrestling Illustrated, Inside Wrestler, those magazines that gave you the early introductions.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, growing up in the backyard of two of the big promotions, of course, WWE's headquarters is 15 minutes from my house, and obviously not far from Philly. I started watching ECW. I was a senior in college, so this was late 94 into 1995. And I remember, as most people did back then, I got home from the bar on a Saturday night at 1:30 in the morning, and I was not did not have a right mind, of course. And I went back to the dorm with Dr. G and a couple of other guys, that we knew in the dorm, our good friends. And we were, the party didn't end. We just had to get out of the bar. So we were, watching TV, screwing around. I think it was the winter, so I think we were watching the Knicks or something. And MSG Network, which is one of the local TV networks here in the area, cable networks. So the Knicks were, I think it was a Knick game on the West Coast. I think they were playing the Lakers or the Clippers or something. So we were watching the game. We were still pounding drinks, drinking beers, and the game ended. And all of a sudden, and I read about it in the mags, but I didn't know anything about the TV, because I read about ECW in the mags when they were still Eastern Championship Wrestling, and obviously the fall in '94 with the whole, Shane Douglas throwing the belt down, and Dennis Corluzzo crapping his pants about it and everything. I did know all that stuff, so I had known of this, the Eastern Championship Wrestling that would become ECW. I didn't know anything about times or when it would be on TV or whatever. So sure enough, it's 3:00 in the morning, or 2:30 in the morning. We're still drinking. It's a Saturday night. The Knicks post game had ended, and all of a sudden I hear the wow, 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 and all of a sudden we're all like, "Holy shit! I've never watched this before." And we're sitting there. I mean, we're just fucking shit faced. Oh Christ! I think if Superstars came on, I would have been entertained. And I'm watching it, and I remember one of the first things was JT Smith. You remember JT Smith? And he was part of he joined the Full-Blooded Italians, and of course he started he was the guy that originated the "you fucked up" chants, because his gimmick was he would try to do something on the top rope, but he always slipped and fell. So of course the building full of degenerates at the ECW arena would chant "you fucked up," and that's where that started. And that's where I was introduced to that. And then I remember watching, within the next year, obviously, I was exposed to Sabu. And I knew Taz, and I loved Shane Douglas. Shane Douglas, to me, and this is why I love Shane Douglas, and you'll laugh at this and not be surprised about it one bit. I always considered Shane Douglas the Triple H of ECW. He was the one that wasn't the hardcore guy. He was like the franchise. He was, but he wasn't the one that was, I mean, he would be hardcore, but he wasn't like the, Axel and Ian Rotten or any of those other psychopaths. He was like the guy, but he wasn't the hardcore guy. And I feel like that was like the Triple H of ECW. So I did love Shane Douglas. But I remember knowing about Sabu, and the first time I saw him with the scars all over his chest and everything. And I'm like, wow, this guy's real. This is a real guy. And I remember getting, I think I rented it. I rented the first pay-per-view. I rented Barely Legal in April. I think it was like May of '97. And then I got hooked, and I watched ECW for the next, obviously, few years. Sabu it was hard for me to wrap my head around him. He was a unique, because I was used to Sandman and Taz, and and I remember the Ian and Axel Rotten, the Bloodsport match, or I guess the kickboxer match with the taped fist in the glass and all that. But this is the first time I had seen a guy like Sabu, and I'm like, this is fucking insane. And then I looked him up, and I saw he was the Sheik, the original Sheik's nephew and stuff. And I'm like, all right, that makes sense. And then I'll tell you the match that hooked me for liking Sabu, and that was, I think it was August. We'll have to look it up. I think it was July or August of '97. Sabu and Terry Funk wrestled for the ECW World Title in a barbed wire match.
Yeah,
where the barbed wire replaced the ropes. And those guys absolutely throttled each other. Sabu actually won the title that night. And meanwhile, they spent the end of the match literally picking barbs out of their crotch. I would lose my shit if I was sitting there having to pick barbs out of my sack. So that was my exposure to Sabu. And then I always said, like, he seemed to fit the Attitude Era. I don't know if he ever, and we'll get into this in terms of we are going to go through the looking glass and definitely do some what ifs with Sabu tonight. But I can understand why, looking back now, I can understand why he didn't get as big a fair shake in the big two as he did or didn't. But that was easily my favorite match of his. Do you have any matches of his specifically that strike your fancy?
I think the one that I really enjoy, and it was one of my earliest exposures to an actual match of Sabu, is on the way to watch the original three-way dance, because I'd heard so much about it. I'd heard how great a match it was, and you're talking the players, Terry Funk, Sabu, and Shane Douglas, the pillars of the early days of ECW. So that I really enjoy that match. I think it was very unique when you put it in the time frame of wrestling and recognize that it was, if not the first three-way match, one of the first. It's certainly the first match that had any big exposure to it. And even though that exposure was limited to ECW television at the time, and the presentation in the Aptamags, I didn't know of a three-way match before then. And we know that those, multi-man matches have become a staple in the industry today. So you really, it's a very pioneering match. Very much like the original ladder matches with Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels and Razor. Like, when you compare them to what you get today, they don't necessarily stack up, but in the time and in the moment, they were sensational because they were so unique. And that three-way dance was definitely one of those. And obviously the Sabu RVD match.
Right. That's that one too. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. That's just, I mean, I know they had a couple, but the first one was just, that was a phenomenal match. So yeah, those were the matches I'd heard about them. And so once I had access to see those matches, it was like, I had to look at them. I had to watch those as soon as I could.
Right. Now, this is obviously if you're new to the show, by the way, welcome. It's an honor to have you. Go to placetobe.podbean.com or wherever your podcast catcher is, and go back through the archive. We have a ton of great episodes throughout the years. We've done multiple obit episodes like this. The two that, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, I don't know if we've done more than two. I know we did one on Scott Hall.
Yep.
And this past fall, I thought one of our best ones, I think one of our best overall episodes was the one we did on Sid.
Yes.
I thought our Sid episode was pretty great. I mean, we had some banging what ifs for him. We really did. Remember we had that 92 through 94. You guys have to listen to it. If you're new to the show, please listen to all of them. But after you finish this episode, search out the one Dave and I, what was it, like September, October of last year?
Yeah, last year.
Yeah, we did an episode on when Sid passed away. We did a what if, and Dave and I think we came up with one of our coolest what ifs ever. When if Sid had been champion from 92 through 94 in WWF, it was awesome. You have to listen to it. It literally is one of my favorite episodes that I've ever done. It was great. But anyway, are those the only two we've done? Have we done any other obits?
We've done we also did an episode where we looked at a few people who had passed away.
Oh yes, we did
and,
like a
yeah,
I remember we did like a Pillman, we did an
Kurt,
Eddie, we did
Owen,
Eddie and right. That's right. I do remember that.
But the
So we
Raiders,
don't do
I
these
definitely
often.
remember the Scott Hall. No, we don't do them often. I remember the Scott Hall one was. I enjoyed that one too. I think we had did quite some good.
We did.
Sort of
I think we had like a
one.
Yeah, we did. I think we had like one of the storylines, like him winning the WCW belt in like '98 or '99 or whatever. It was a great. Obviously, check out all our episodes; they're all great. But the obit ones, I'm always proud of because we come up with some pretty good stuff. Because the guys we have, some guys are not easy, and tonight is one of those ones. So I don't know how long we're going to go tonight. Could be long, could be short, or could be whatever. I think we're going to have fun tonight because Sabu is a tricky guy to think of when it comes to going through the looking glass at what ifs with him, because you have to take into account again, one of the most depth-defying guys in the history of the business, but a bit of a flake. That can't be ignored. That business-wise, he always, Now, in his defense, and I'm not in favor in general, Dave. Before we move on, in general, I'm not in favor of wigging out on a booking. And I've talked with wrestlers, John Walters. Justin's for JR's friend, and I've talked with various guys, wrestlers. The worst thing you could do is wig out on a booking, because once that gets around the industry, you're baked. But Sabu is one of those guys you kind of let it slide. Again, guys like Bruiser Brody. Now, Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen never wigged out on bookings; they just didn't stick around. So they weren't the kind of guys you would give belts to. Even though for some odd reason they gave Stan Hansen the WCW or the WCW US title in '89 or '90 into '91, which I thought was strange, or '90, which I thought was odd. Although like Vern Gagne gave him the AWA title, which was freaking stupid. But we all know that story.
And then regretted that decision quite significantly.
Quite instantly. Yes, he did. And of course, he watch the history of AWA documentary, and you'll understand, because he ran over the belt with his truck or whatever. It was crazy nonsense. Anyway, so we are going to go through the looking.
Yeah, but just on that booking thing, I think you said it sort of, you gave, it never really bit Sabu, but I wonder if part of that is tied to the fact that the person he allegedly whiffed out on his booking with was Paul Heyman. And the stories of whether Paul had actually booked him, or the double booking concept. So I wonder if that sort of ended up going in Sabu's favor a little bit of people, because I think Heyman's reputation had started to grow by this point.
Well, that too, and I'm sure Sabu, as much as he loved Paul to death, you're wondering whether the check would clear. So, but again, I always say, that's true. I mean, maybe he wasn't booked, and Paul's just saying it. Revisionist history. The winner goes, the story goes to the winner, or the winner tells the story, whatever it is. Anyway, so all right, so why don't we do this now? Let us open our portal. We're about to go through the looking glass.
Just before we go,
sure. I'm sorry, Dave. Go ahead. What do you got? No, go ahead. What do you got?
I think this is the question that there's going to tie into where we go. The reason that this looking glass, I think, is going to be interesting today ties into this initial question, and that is, I want to ask you, Scott, why do you think, outside of the booking, did he miss the bookings or not? Why do you think Sabu, at his peak in those mid to late 90 years, why do you think he never really was picked up by WCW, WWF? Why is it that he was always either ECW, Japan Independence? Why was it that thing, and why was he not, given those opportunities to really be showcased in the two big leagues at the time?
Okay. All right. I think they're for two different reasons. I'll start with WCW. And he was there I think he was there for a cup of coffee. He was.
They both had cup of coffees. Yeah. Both
like 96-ish. Yeah, like 96-ish. 95.
Late 95.
Yeah. I think Sabu, I think it was a money thing. I think he wanted to get some, I think he wanted, as I say, pick the spinach. I think he wanted some spinach. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, or scarole as us Italians call it. But yeah, I think he wanted a little bread. But then I think he started to notice, because he's not one to suffer fools gladly. So I'm curious if he saw the landscape of the WCW locker room and probably went, I'm not dealing with this shit. Even pre NWO, like early, with Hogan and all of his knucklehead friends, Knobs and fucking Honky Tonk Man and all that, and Duggan and all that crap. But even before the NWO became the asset and liability at the same time in WCW, I feel like Sabu kind of already realized it's not gonna happen for me here. Number one, I don't even know if Bischoff knows what to even do with someone like me. And then you look ahead now to like 99, 2000 when Sandman went there and became Hack. And I'm sure Sabu went back and went, see, this is why I didn't stick around, because I was going to be turned into a cartoon character of hardcore. So I don't know if he would have actually been trusted to I don't know if he actually would have been trusted to, or trusted the company to be booked properly.
Yep.
WWE, I think a lot of that was Vince. I think Vince would have just looked at him and said, I don't know what to do with this guy. Number one, Sabu never had the best promo skills, and Vince always needed somebody who could work the stick. And most of Sabu's prime in ECW, he had Bill Alfonso. And at that time in the Attitude Era, managers and stuff were not the thing in WWF, 98, 99, even 97. So I think Vince looked at this guy and went, this guy doesn't talk. I mean, he's gives the look. He says a little bit, but I don't know. So I don't know if WWF, I don't think Vince would have looked at him and said, I don't know what to do with this guy. I'm not going to make him, the Iron Sheik. I mean, he's not going to, do the what do you call it? The Syrian or the Persian clubs or whatever. Like, we're not going to have, freaking gimmicks from 1980. You know what I mean? Like, so I think what it came down to, I think WCW is more Sabu. I just don't think Sabu trusted WCW to do him right. I think he would have adapted well to WWF because I think he probably trusted Vince as a good businessman. I think someone like Vince or even Pritchard or the regular booking team during the Attitude Era, the Pats, the Blackjack Lances, those guys, they probably looked at him and said, I got to be honest, Vince, I know the guy's popular and he's big with the fans, but I don't know what to do with this guy. I don't think we should change his gimmick to something dopey, and we'll talk about it because apparently he was rumored to be something, and we'll get to it when we go through the portal. But I just think the brain trust in Stamford probably looked at him and went, Vince, I don't know what to do with him. I mean, he doesn't talk. Vince didn't always totally dip his toe into the hardcore stuff till probably 99, even into 2000. Most of 98, 99 was the tone of the show and the raunchiness and, the stone cold middle fingers, the beers, women with, big boobs and stuff like that. But I think the quote even though he had the hardcore belt, Vince's hardcore wrestling had a certain temperance to it. Whereas, ECW, I mean, do you think Vince would ever have a match, a taped fist glass match like with Ian and Axl? Vincent would have no idea what to do. No idea what to do. So I think the reason he didn't go to the big two is because in WCW, I think he personally, Sabu, thought that he was just going to get completely treated like some type of piece of garbage and booked completely wrong. Didn't trust the what could have ended up being very political, and of course it did end up being very political, obviously. But with WWF, I just think that was them saying, I don't know what to do with this guy. They trust guys to be good stick men and work a good promo and put over yourself and whatever feud you're in. But that wasn't Sabu. Sabu was a silent assassin who had, the Bill Alfonsos doing it for him And I personally don't think that the brain trust in WWF, again, the Pats, the Black Lanzas, the Bruce Pritchards, I don't think they would have known what to do with him without neutering him. And the last thing you want to do is neuter a guy like, which is why Sandman never went there for the same reason. Those guys would have got neutered. Taz is different. Taz by 2000 was kind of done with, and Taz wasn't really the hardcore guy in terms of weapons and stuff. Taz was he was a suplex machine.
Yep.
Taz was easy to book in WWE. He wasn't booked great, but Taz also was probably in the back end of his career, and he ended up, of course, being a great commentator. But a guy like Sabu, I just don't know if WWF would have looked at him and said, all right, I think we know what to do with this guy. Because, again, they trust their guys to put their own stuff over, and Sabu didn't really talk much. So, personally, that's what I think, Sabu. I think that's what hindered Sabu to go to the WWF. WCW, I just don't think he trusted it. I think he personally, the businessman that he is, I don't know if he ever really would have trusted having it done right in WCW. So that's my take.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think some of those things. I totally agree with you on a lot of what you've said. I think one of the big keys there is what you've mentioned about his character and the need to protect his character. I think there's one thing that became very clear when you look at his entire career is he was very protective of the character he developed. Even the no talking bit. I mean, I know it was a long time before. He never did interviews in the heyday, but even as you moved into the internet era and I'll use the term the broken kayfabe era, the modern era of, I mean, it's not even earlier than modern, but that era of everyone knows their real names. We all know that it's a work. We all know that it's so as everyone started to do their out of character interviews, like The Undertaker, Sabu held on to his character and his gimmick for so long that he wasn't the talker, that he didn't do interviews. So I think he was very protective of that character, and I don't think he would have been willing to put it in the hands of someone he didn't trust or someone that he wasn't certain would be able to utilize it properly. And I think, you've mentioned there, like WCW was notorious for mucking things up. But I also think from a WWF perspective, I wonder if there's an element where he looked at like what happened to Shane Douglas in '95, and he went, I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to risk them trying to muck up my character. I've built it. I've grown it. So I think there's that element from him. But I think on the flip side, I think part of it is his wrestling style. I mean, I mentioned before we had the innovator of the three-way dance. Sabu is really the innovator of the hardcore wrestling style. Like I'm sorry, I know ECW became known for that style of wrestling, but the reality is Sabu's entry into ECW, I think, really put it at the upper end of the company, because prior to that, it had been Shane Douglas and Terry Funk, and they might do brawls all around the arena, but it was the arrival of Sabu that brought in the chairs and the tables and the barbed wire and the really going over the top and using those items in new and innovative ways. The jumping off the chair, the moonsault through the two chairs, going through the table, like that was all Sabu brought that into prominence. I know that it obviously existed outside of that, and Mick Foley, Japan and Mick Foley and all that. You've got that element, but Sabu brought it to that accepted mainstream element in the US, I think. So I think that style became synonymous with who he was, and I don't think either Vince or Eric Bischoff at the time of his big prominence, that 94, 95, 96, I don't think they'd be willing. They know how to work it into their company. I don't think they'd be willing to let the matches go that way, which then diminishes the impact of who Sabu was, because that's who people wanted to see. They wanted to see that type of wrestling, And if you're not going to get it, why bother? So I think Vince would have been very reluctant to allow that style of wrestling in the mid-90s. And even, as you said, even the early Attitude Era, it wasn't until sort of 99, 2000 that became a bit more of the, we can see the big vicious chair shots and the use of the weapons and all that. And perhaps, Sabu in that hardcore division could have been very interesting in 99. That's a very easy spot to see him in. But I just don't think in the early to mid 90s, when he really was gathering his best momentum before injuries started to hit his body, I don't think either company would have really been willing to let him wrestle that style. And so I think that's one of the key reasons why he probably never got the shot earlier in his career. And then I think by the time you get to 99, 2000, you're already seeing WCW is a shambles, and I don't want to touch it with a 10-foot barge pole. And I think he had the fear of what had happened to guys like, like Shane Douglas, like Taz. He's watched them go into the company and really not get used very well. Had their momentum absolutely stalled. Yeah. And I think Sabu would have gone, I'm not willing to do that. And that's why I don't think we ever got Sabu until the reboot of ECW in 2005. And I think only then, because initially Paul Heyman had been given the opportunity to take the reins early on of the ECW booking in 2005.
And again, he got paid. And that paycheck was probably more than anything he had probably in the 90s. I mean, I'm sure Japan he got paid. I'm sure Japan he probably got paid pretty well. Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I think we're dead on in that. So we're gonna take some liberties, and I'll let you obviously steer the ship, as you always do, exemplary, Dave. And we'll do our best to try and see what alternate universes did for Sabu in his career. So I'll let you steer. How do you want to start, Dave? I'll let you.
I think we'll start. I think we'll just start. At the time on a timeline perspective. So
sure. Okay.
One of the things, so in preparing for this and listening to some other podcasts that have been going, I'll get to that in just a second. I was very surprised to learn, and I didn't know this, the wrestling historian that I am, as much love as I have for wrestling in the 90s, I was absolutely shocked to learn that Sabu had some dark matches in WWF in October of 1993. And if you listen to From the Vault, episode 3, Callum McDougall actually reviewed that match.
He did.
And I had no idea that it even happens. And we know that those dark matches are usually opportunities. Either the contract is about to come or has already been offered. Is normally where those dark matches are done to determine, are we going to offer a guy a spot or not? Now, for whatever reason, Sabu did not go to work with WWF in late 93, but it raises the question: what if if the dark match, it may have been successful, they may have offered him a contract and he may have knocked it back, but he hadn't really hit the big time yet in the US in late 93. It wasn't until sort of 94, 95 that he really made his run in ECW. So you've got very early, he'd certainly started to make his name known on the independent circuit, the nephew of the Sheik, those more tougher style matches, and that he was willing to put his body through. I think he probably had that early Cactus Jack image perception to him, that he was willing to do whatever it took. So what if he had signed a contract in late 93 and essentially those dark matches began a run late 93 into 94? What might that have looked like? How could Sabu have been used in that time period? Because we were still very much in the high gimmick era. Late 93 is, that's the whole Lex Express moving into the Yokozuna as the champ and the Quebecers and the Hart family feud's just about to kick off, and Tatanka's just on the end of his run, and Doink's still very prominent. You're at the back end of that time period. So, what might it have looked like? If he picked up, how could he have been used? He's a littler guy. He's not a big giant. So I think, if he was to stay there, I think you're looking very early on as a guy who's probably going to be facing the Bob Spark Plug Hollies and the 1-2-3 Kid. And I think, and I wonder if that might have been your early target. You hook him into some matches with Kid. I wonder if that's where you start him off as, and you bring him in as an opponent for Kid, because I think they could have had some good matches.
I agree. It's interesting. I have to check that match out. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, because I'm obviously, he would lean into the hardcore stuff as we continued on, but I think Vince realized he had a very unique character. He probably could have tempered the hardcore aspect of it, and I think Sabu might have been a little more amiable to wrestle a certain way at that moment in his career while he was still young and not quite sure what to do yet, and then maybe grown into the homicidal genocidal down the line. But obviously he might have, not that, WWF guys, except for the upper guys, are making a ton of money in 93, 94, because Vince would start hitting a little bit of a financial dip in those middle years in the 90s. But he would still get paid pretty well. And, if you're doing dark matches, you're obviously, looking to make some buck. I think matches with Kid would have been good. I think he's a guy that might have thrived, because as we've talked about in the past, Dave, and I've talked about this on other shows too, even though Raw was the quote flagship show even for WWF in 93, 94 when the show started, it wasn't treated like the flagship show. I still felt like it was kind of an extended Cindy show, even though it was, on the network and, it was on USA and such. I feel like Sabu, and I agree with you on the 1-2-3 Kid thing. I think Waltman would have given him some good matches, and I think they would have had a good growing period between the two of them. But I could easily have seen while Raw was going to be promoting the big feuds and, the Brett stuff and Lawler and, Shawn and all that kind of stuff. I do think that the Cindies, the Superstars and Challenge and stuff, would have been a good platform for Sabu to grow. And then maybe you start putting him maybe in the middle of, Raw was only an hour, when it would be 2 hours. And you could stick, although it was an hour for what, 4 years, I guess?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It wasn't until they did the whole, set reboot and everything. So I don't know. I don't know if his character would have been able to make it on Raw, unless he really, thrived and got himself over to the point where he could have reached the upper mid card. I feel like a guy like Shawn might have been a little skittish of a guy like him. I mean, when Shawn was in his peak in 96, Mick Foley scared the crap out of him. Yeah. So if you're talking about building up in the mid card, maybe he could have a guy like, guys like an Adam Bomb, or I don't know, somebody like that could kind of absorb a guy like him. Maybe could have helped put over, but I think what would have hurt Sabu at some point, even going into 94, obviously, would guys like, and I'm not saying that there was a political thing there. I'm not going to say the Click would have done anything to him, because the Click wasn't that. Really, only Bigelow was the one that suffered that, and I guess D. Douglas. But would a guy like a Razor Ramon
gone, I don't know, what am I mean, maybe Razor would have, because he was, sometimes he was kind of a lunatic too. So maybe the Click would have taken a guy like Sabu and went, you know what, why don't we kind of bring this guy into the fold? He might have some fun. We might get a little bank out of it. Maybe this guy comes out of nowhere, attacks Scott Hall or attacks Razor Ramon, and maybe we get some kind of a elevated intercontinental title feud. Let's say that we don't get the 94 Rumble comes around. We don't get the Diesel Jesus push, and Diesel doesn't win the IC belt, and that's the big feud through the summer with Razor and for the IC belt leading to SummerSlam. Perhaps a guy like Sabu becomes very impressionable to the booking, and they go, you know what? Maybe a guy like Razor Ramon could thrive with a crazy whack job guy like this dude. And perhaps it's somebody that the audience could kind of gravitate towards as a crazy heel. That's not, that's not Jeff Jarrett, or some milquetoasty, uninteresting heel. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if they wanted to put an effort into a guy like him, I could very easily see WWF strapping a firecracker to him. I wouldn't say a rocket ship. And maybe a guy like Razor Ramon could be like, I could put this guy over, and this guy, we could work together, make some music and make some bank. And perhaps Sabu could get some shine on Raw and shine on a show like a King of the Ring. He could be in a qualifier or whatever, and maybe lean towards a possible IC title match between Razor and Sabu at SummerSlam '94.
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility. I think if you took this sort of direction, like I think you could build to that. I actually like that really much. So I mean, he's coming in October, so he's not really in time for Survivor Series. So you're going to be building him more post Survivor Series '93. So you come out of Survivor Series '93, you're probably starting him on Superstars, and he's having a couple these matches against the nobodies where he's probably coming as a heel. You bring him in as a heel. He has a couple of these matches against the nobodies. To just build up that he'll do whatever it takes to win, and he'll put his body on the line a little bit, but he'll cheat as well. You need him cheating to have that heel side, and you're wanting to build to a match with kids. So you might even have him do a match with Marty Jannetty on, maybe a feature match on Superstars in sort of December, mid-December against Marty Jannetty, and he wins that. Then maybe, looking at the time frame, you could even put him in a match against Owen, because you're just getting ready to turn Owen, and maybe these two have a bit of a match, and Owen, something happens. Sabu does something. Maybe this is the first time that we see him throw someone into a table or hit someone with a chair. So maybe Sabu gets disqualified, but it's this idea of Owen's gotten beaten down a little bit, and Brett didn't come out to help him. You can sort of play into that, but Owen and Sabu could have a good match. And I think then you build to this idea of maybe Sabu and Kid are going to face each other at the Royal Rumble. You can build that up as one of your undercard matches. They're giving Sabu a bit of airtime, and maybe even a match on Raw to help get that bigger the eyes on him. But you have that match at Royal Rumble, and Sabu goes over. He beats Kid in I think they would have an absolute barn burner of a match. I think in 93, 94, Sabu is still very injury free. He doesn't need to use the tables or the chairs yet. They're both flying around, high paced, fast match, and Sabu gets the win. Maybe he does. Maybe he hits him with it, runs him into the table on the outside, or does something crazy like puts Kid on the announcer's table and does a moonsault onto the outside onto Kid on the table. It might not necessarily break yet, but you've got this idea that, he'll even put his body through the pain to do it, gets the victory over Kid. And maybe you get a couple of rematches on Raw, but because of what he's doing to the Kid, maybe, and that's where you continue it. Like, he puts the Kid through hell, and then you get a couple of subsequent rematches on Raw, but Sabu is always, it's, a chair will come in or a table will come in, and that's getting the attention of Razor, because Razor is Kid's friend.
Right.
And so Razor starts coming to the aid of Kid post-match. And then one day when he's doing that, Sabu just clocks him with the chair, gets him in the back. So you probably go through, maybe they get their rematch at WrestleMania. Maybe you have another rematch at WrestleMania. It's like you said. So you're getting through that summer, and you've got the belt still on Razor coming out of that WrestleMania. And you've had the ladder match between Shawn and Razor. So that's sort of, you keep that element. But then coming out of that, Sabu is attacking Kid after a match, and Razor comes down, and while that happens, Sabu hits him in the back with a chair. And so then you start to build, maybe like you said, we don't have the Diesel run, but Sabu gets the shot at King of the Ring. Maybe they put those two in a match at King of the Ring, and maybe it ends in a DQ. Sabu doesn't get the win, doesn't take the title, because I don't know that they put the belt on him because of his size, but he can certainly make it difficult so that you want that rematch at SummerSlam. And maybe you do something in that rematch at SummerSlam, whether it be a no DQ match or something that can allow Sabu to do a few of these things that he's known to do, but you're going to get it really for the first time on pay-per-view in a big scale, like a table spot or a double chair spot in the ring. So it's a no DQ match. But in the end, Razor gets the win. So you keep the belt on Razor, but he's had that big feature match at SummerSlam. Then sort of for the next couple of months, he can just be doing some matches again. Hakushi's in the company by now. You've got that whole, Barry Horowitz, Hakushi, Skipper all in there. So he can sort of fit into doing a couple of matches with them. But I wonder if you could then sort of build that, maybe he becomes a target of DiBiase wants to sign him to the corporation. And you could, I think his style would have eventually seen him turn babyface. The same thing happened with Hakushi when he came in. Just because he was bringing something unique to WWF, the fans ended up liking what they were seeing, and they turned him babyface. I think that would happen with Sabu. They would like that this guy is so unique and puts his body on the line, and that they can start to get behind him. And so DiBiase wants to make him a member of the corporation, and Sabu refuses. He doesn't have to talk, but it can just be, throws the cash in his face or whatever. And so you could start a series with some of, with the guys like Tatanka and maybe a match against Bam Bam Bigelow. You could have him in that little undercard mix of the corporation. And you can sort of take that out of the back end of 95. And then in 96, you've got the arrival of Mankind, who's coming in as the heel to fight against Undertaker. But can you imagine if, to build Mankind for the Undertaker, you have Mick and Sabu wrestle at In Your House and King of the Ring, and you really sort of let Mankind and Sabu just go hammer and tong for a couple of big matches to help get Mankind ready for the Undertaker. I think those we know Mick and Sabu will have brilliant matches. Imagine that on the scale when he's had a couple of years of build behind him in the company. I think you could use Sabu to basically get Mick over when he arrives. And then it might be that Sabu decides now's the time that's the time then to head off into the sunset and leave and go to ECW, while Mick's coming in. Sabu goes the other way and becomes like the replacement for for Mick Foley coming to the WWE.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think, it may even open the door for Sabu when he gets to ECW to have kind of that extra cred that, that extra cred that being in the WWF would have given him that he didn't have in the Prime universe. And having great matches with guys that are, just generally trusted, in the business, I think, would have helped him as well, and he would have been maybe more prepared, and maybe would have been instrumental in helping kind of the creative process for ECW when he got there. And then Mick, I think the only I don't say it's a bad part, because if you're used to Sabu throughout 94, 95, and then Mick, of course, debuts right after WrestleMania in 96, maybe the fans and the audience would have probably gotten accustomed to that style, and maybe Vince and the bookers would have perhaps been more open to expanding that style of wrestling, even in 96, before we even get to 97, and because the exposure that fans had to that wrestling, not only in WWF, if Sabu had thrived in that environment those couple of years, but that fans were watching more stuff in the mid 90s, that I think he would have kind of helped WWF advance their thinking sooner rather than later, which would would have helped them adapt better to the news, to the audience and their audiences, the new young crowd and their way of thinking. Yeah. Because obviously, you don't have those Federation fans anymore. They've grown up. They're in high school. They're in college. They're 20-somethings. They're virile. They're horny. They love violence, and they're a different kind of fan now. And Doink and, and TL Hopper and all these other, the fans would have obviously poo-pooed. They did anyway, but I think they would have. I think you would have seen less of that if Sabu had made that kind of an impact in that early into mid 90s. I think Dave, you hit on advancing that style of wrestling sooner for WWF. So Sabu, I think, would have left a mark there. Then going into ECW, I think he would have been maybe a little bit more acute to helping Paul grow, and maybe Dave, he's not as flaky.
Yeah.
Wigging in and out and bouncing all over the place, because he had a sense of kind of the responsibility to stay in a promotion if you're booked and made to look strong. So I like that. I like that idea. I'm impressed. I think he could have thrived in that environment had he been adaptable, or adapted, or got the eye of the booking team in WWF in 93, and his dark matches, had been noticed by the powers that be. As Dave mentioned quickly, programming note, because I never learned to not shill. Check out the newest episode of From the Vault, which is our quick little pod blasts as the WWE Vault has grown and they've started this WCW YouTube channel. To watch this, some of the Sabu stuff he did, matches he did, including this one that Dave and I are talking about. I like your thinking on that, Dave. I do. I think that would have helped everybody. I think it would have helped the WWF, and it would have helped Sabu. All right. I'm turning the portal around. I'm pointing to another galaxy. What do we got now?
Well, this one I'm sure more people will be aware of. If you're a fan of wrestling history, I think it's commonly known that Sabu did actually spend a very short period of time in WCW in late '95.
Correct.
He came into WCW. So obviously in our understanding of the world, he was in ECW for a couple of years, and we alluded to it earlier in the show where we talked about the fact that there was an incident where he no-showed a ECW event that he had been advertised for. Paul Heyman and Sabu have different opinions of the nature of that no-show, but he no-showed and was subsequently fired from ECW, and so he spent some time. That was in 1995, and so he spent some time in Japan, and he signed on with WCW in like August September time period, and debuts on Nitro against Alex Wright on September 11, 1995.
Mhm.
So we have Sabu in the heyday, this um, growing product of WCW Nitro. Here he is. He faces Sabu. He wins the match, but then it's reversed because he'd used a table. So we're playing into that because his gimmick was established. He then wrestles Mr. JL at
Yep.
both Nitro and Hell and Havoc. JL obviously being Jerry Lynn,
Yep.
who went on to have his own prominent career in ECW, and then he wrestles Disco. So we've got this time period where in sort of September, October, he's competing on Nitro and wrestles at Halloween Havoc in matches against these lower card guys, but he's getting victories. He's beating Alex Wright, Disco Inferno, Jerry Lynn, but not called Jerry Lynn. And then he ups and leaves. He's gone, leaves the company for. I think you probably nailed it on the head early. He probably saw what was going on and didn't really trust that WCW would be able to use his character to its best qualities. But what if he stayed? What if he didn't leave? What if he was still around in sort of November, December '95 and moving into '96? What then for Sabu? I think this is our next looking glass, and I think the answer is I think the early answer is very easy to work out, because this is also the time period that Eric Bischoff brings in Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Chris Benoit.
Mhm.
And I think straightforward. I think with Sabu having beaten Alex Wright and Disco Inferno and Jerry Lynn, it's very clear that they're going to put him in a similar standing to where those guys came in. And I think where you're looking at is, I think that's the start point. He's going to be wrestling Benoit, Malenko, and Eddie in those that late sort of 95, 96. We're going to see him on Nitro regularly, probably different variations of those guys trying to put on some pretty high-paced and hard-hitting matches.
Absolutely. And I feel like pre NWO Bischoff, I think he would have been more open-minded. I mean, yeah, I think Bischoff's window of paying attention to of paying attention to uh the whole card and the whole roster before he got obsessed with driving around with Hogan and Harleys and meeting Jay Leno and all that other crap. I think he saw something there. And I feel like the guys like Benoit and Eddie and them, I think, would have adapted to wanting to wrestle kind of a tighter style. I think Sabu would have found a way to I think Sabu would have found a way to integrate that kind of his hectic, hardcore style into a regular kind of mat-based, everyday match style. Because you can't, you're not going to have hardcore matches every week. WCW didn't start thinking that way till '99, and by then nobody cared.
Yeah.
So I think if Sabu, this is where Sabu's maturity level comes on display, because if he realizes, all right, I can't wrestle like a lunatic here, like I would have in ECW, and we're not, I could have kind of settled in a little bit and maybe be a little more snug. Guys like Eddie and Benoit had no problem, wrestling snug. And I think if Sabu if they could have got them to trust him and work both ways on it, I do think that mid card and top of the card, or maybe I'll say bottom of the card, the beginning of the show, the curtain jerkers, I guess you could say, into the mid card would have really thrived in WCW at a time when WWS roster was not the best.
Yeah.
So I like your thinking on that, and I do think that he could have been in the race for the TV title, and he could have kind of grown his resume a little bit. The question I have then is, on the flip side, if he's in WCW, Dave, and thriving, say through 90, what would you say the timeline would have been? Maybe into 98.
We're going into 96 initially,
right?
So yeah.
Had he kept going past and WCW liked him and signed him to a longer term deal, I'm curious what would have happened to ECW without him in those couple of years, because I feel like one of the guys that Paul relied upon to thrive and push the tone of the promotion was Sabu. So I'm curious if Sabu is still in WCW, if that affects ECW's growth to the masses as a promotion.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That really is. I think, yes, Sabu, that would play it would have a big impact in those ongoing RVD and Taz storylines. And that's where the question sits. I think the benefit that you've got is, number one, you still have RVD and Taz in ECW and able to be utilized the way they can be. And further to that, you really have Paul Heyman at his creative best. And I think Heyman would have, if he didn't have Sabu, he would have found someone else. He would have worked out how to get what he wanted over. And that's the beauty of Heyman. I think he's always had that ability to find guys that he can use and plug into spots and make it work. And whereas you might not have had the specific style and character of Sabu, the ECW growth in that sort of 96, 97, 98 time period is built on the RVD Taz storyline and the Sabu Taz storyline. Those ones are, and then really sort of have a lot of impact on the growth of those characters.
Yep.
I just see that Paul Heyman probably would have found other guys to make use of to help build those characters, and even putting them against each other. Obviously, RVD and Taz against each other would have been a feature spot. So I think ECW would have found a way to still grow in that time period. It just would have been on the back of someone else that Heyman would utilize, because those were his strengths at the time.
Right.
I think that, like you said, we talk about getting back to the WCW conversation, that the tighter style and the mat-based thing. I think what we all often forget about Sabu is that we like to highlight, he was this daredevil, this guy who used the weapons and the chairs and the tables and the big spots. But you look at that three-way dance with Funk and Shane Douglas, there's not a lot of gimmick spots in there. His matches against RVD, they grew and built so that those spots had an impact, but those matches weren't 10-minute, spot fest. They were building mat-based matches that built to these gimmick spots. I think Sabu knew how to work that style, and with Benoit and Eddie and Dean in WCW, he would have adapted very easily, and I think he would have been able to fit in with those. And I think I think you're looking at a TV title run. I would ask the question, if and WCW were known to still refer to past history. Guys came into WCW that was referenced that they come from ECW or they came from elsewhere, whereas WWF always, ignored the past, and this was a new character. Would it be of benefit? I wonder if the benefit would have been in getting a storyline built towards Sabu and Benoit, the crippling gimmick, the crippler gimmick, that Benoit broke Sabu's neck. And you could even play that was part of the reason why he left ECW, because Benoit had broken his neck. And you can build up to a big series. I mean, imagine a series. You've built these guys going against each other, and one of Benoit or Sabu takes the TV title, and the other one comes for him. Sabu wants revenge for having his neck broken by Chris Benoit. And you build to these big pay-per-view, a big pay-per-view match in, early to mid 96, that sort of that super brawl, fall brawl time period. Is it not fall brawl, sorry, super brawl, slamboree time
slamboree, and uncensored,
yeah, that time, uncensored. There you go. How perfect would it be to have a match between Sabu and Chris Benoit in sort of he broke my neck and I want my revenge.
Right.
That would be a perfect place to build to a match between those two. And it doesn't matter who wins the title. I think that the build would make for a tremendous build. These guys build their tension towards this rematch that we never really got in ECW. Like I said, by the time Sabu had recovered, they were all on their, you've got the misbooking and they're on their way out, and Benoit's on his way out as well. So later in the year, so you can play up the injury in the past, let these two go at it, and maybe you put the TV title on Sabu for a little while, and you let him then have some rematches, and that's when you maybe create the opportunity. He wins the TV title, let's say Uncensored, and in the time period between Uncensored and the arrival of Hall and Nash in late May, June, you could have him, maybe he has a TV match against Sting. That's something I could see Sting being willing to do, wrestle Sabu. I don't know if Luger, or definitely don't think Hogan would ever get in the ring with him, but I could see Sting doing a Nitro match with Sabu. But I think the problem for Sabu comes with the arrival of Hall and Nash, because I think once they turn up, the creative focus is going to move off Sabu, because they really had it on the NWO, the growth of the NWO, and they were looking at the Horsemen and the Dungeon of Doom in the building of that.
Right.
And I think Sabu gets lost in the massive numbers of people they had under contract.
Yeah, of course. And then maybe he's a guy that by then, say 97, 98, by then he turns into a guy that Vince looks at and goes, oh, maybe this is a guy the fans like as I'm starting to grow my attitude. And plucks him away as WCW ignores him, and we get and we get him in WWF later on down the line.
Yep.
So it may work out.
It would, or you take him in '97. You know, the NWO comes in like that mid '96, and through the years, Sabu sees like, I'm not getting booked really. I'm not getting a prominent role anymore. I've been pushed to the side. He probably becomes a victim of an NWO beatdown at some point, and you could just sort of see Sabu going, I'm done. I think I need to get out. Maybe ask for his release. And Heyman brings him in. This is the time that Heyman brings him back, because you can still work him with RVD and Taz, but by bringing him back, you're bringing him back as that representation of WCW, because that's where he was, and that, you know, the way that ECW played so well into the Eric Bischoff and WCW are the enemy, and ECW guys are the honorable ones. You know, they stand up for the ECW name, while the WCW takes all our stars. They took Sabu and Benoit and Eddie, and now Sabu is coming back. This traitor is coming back. Imagine the heel heat they could put on Sabu bringing him back. Even though the fans would love to see him, they'd easily be able to manipulate the fans to have him be booed and be the heel, as this is the guy that went to WCW. This is Eric Bischoff's boy, come back.
Right. And that, I think that he stays and becomes a North American, a North American superstar, and then he never heads to Japan, and he never bounces around everywhere, and he stays trustworthy to, and then who knows? I mean, maybe this is a guy that Vince could make an Intercontinental Champion. I don't know if you make him a World Champion, or perhaps Dave, that in WCW he could stretch himself. I mean, I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't think he ever would have gotten a world title rub unless he stayed into '99 and 2000 when everything was hitting the shitter and everybody was gone.
Yeah, I even then, I don't think he would have ever fit the mold of what WCW would see as a world champion. I don't think he'd even fit the mold as a US champion in WCW, unfortunately.
No, probably not. Probably not. And I think perhaps if he came back WWF, maybe he would get a hardcore title, maybe even like a European title run or something like that. He never had in WWF. Yeah, he totally had ECW, he totally, because he kind of blends in with the rest of those guys in the upper card, that he could have been a world world champion in ECW, and of course he ended up in the Prime universe. He did become a world champion in ECW. But again, you don't have to be a world champion to end up being one of the best of all time, Scott Hall. So maybe in that realm, he would have thrived in the mid card, particularly in WCW, where he could have been a little bit more fancy free in the ring, and maybe not as shackled as Vince was in terms of expressing yourself in a storytelling sense, unless he was trusted by the guys, the Pritchards and those kind of guys. But I think your thinking's dead on, Dave, and I think he could have grown as a superstar. And and been a guy that could have lasted for several years. And then maybe by the time that WCW's out of business and we get to 2001, Sabu ends up being somebody that Vince trusts during the invasion, and maybe he gets like an RVD-ish look.
Oh, yeah.
And suddenly he's a guy that sticks around into 02 and Ruthless Aggression and that kind of thing, you know? So you never know.
Yeah.
You never know.
know.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was trust. And I think that if he was trusted, if there was trust on both sides between him and the promotion, whichever one, and vice versa, things might have been very different for his career in North America in that late 90s stretch. I like your thinking definitely about the cruisers and the kind of the mid-card thing. And I think a guy like Sabu could have enhanced the guys like Benoit, and even Rey Mysterio and Dean Malenko. You know, we just don't talk about Eddie Benoit because they're the good mid-card guys, but you know, a guy like Ray and Dean and some of the what about a Sabu Jericho, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, did they wrestle in ECW? Probably not.
I don't know that they did. Not one-on-one.
No, I don't think so. I think you're right.
It might have been a tag match or something, but I don't think they did face each other. But yeah, you've got that whole division, because you've got the influx of that crew. Then you've got the arrival of Jericho, and then you've got the arrival of Rey Mysterio and Psychosis and Hoovy, and again another group of guys that Sabu would have had some great matches with. And I think that would have been, unfortunately, that would have been the legacy of Sabu in WCW. It would have been that TV title light cruiserweight division where he can put on good matches with these guys. He brings the different element to the table, being the tables, the chairs, the unique style. He brings a different element, but in the end, he's not going to ever be. He's not one of the in crowd. He's not one of Hogan's crew. He's not one of the NWO crew. He's not going to ever move up beyond that. And I think it would have got to the point. I could almost picture it that the only last sampling might have been, if he stayed around for a while, is the arrival of Raven. Sabu might have been either one of Raven's first opponents, or maybe an initial member of the Nest or the Flock, before probably needing to head out the door. I don't know that he would have been able to go much longer, but he could have been someone that Raven could have faced when he first came in as part of the Ravens rules gimmick. You could have had him do that
in the Flock.
Yeah. Be one of the first ones. Before probably, like you said, in the end, I think there was a ceiling on him in WCW, and that was that division, that cruiserweight TV division, those in-ring workers who, you know, just they put on the good matches, and it was only and the limitation is his mic work. I mean, the reason a guy like Eddie was able to get up in Eddie and Benoit, and that they were able to get up into the US title division, was they Eddie's charisma and mic work got him up. Benoit's in-ring work and his ability to work with the bigger guys in a believable way got him up, but I don't know that they would have looked at Sabu in the same way.
Right.
I think he would have been seen as he would have been, you know, they would have had their perception of him, and that would have been it by that time. And I think he would have been looking to get out.
Yeah. Now the last thing we'll get into, and we'll make this quick, is something you mentioned in our pre-notes. So apparently, according to lore, why don't you tell us this? Because I actually think this is kind of amusing. But go ahead.
Well, apparently this is from Sabu himself. In an interview, I was reading this in the past week, but allegedly, according to Sabu, in an interview that he did, and I haven't heard the interview, I was reading a review or notes or follow-up of the interview, but apparently Sabu was originally offered the gimmick of the Sultan, which would have seen him coming into WWF in mid 1996 as the Sultan, and he accepted the offer. He accepted that was intending to come in, and then he was told that the manager was going to be the Iron Sheik, and Sabu wanted his uncle, the original Sheik, to be, and maybe thought that's what they'd agreed to. I don't know the full story, but basically, when he found out that the manager was going to be the Iron Sheik and not his uncle, he reneged. He told them he wasn't going to do it. And now whether he not signed yet or whatever, I don't know. But he ended up not coming in. But that throws up an interesting concept. 1996, Sabu coming into the WWF as the Sultan. Now, I don't. If he'd done that, I don't think we would have had the mask on. I think
No.
they would have brought him in as he was. Very similar to what they did with Foley and the Mankind gimmick. It was different to Cactus Jack, but there was still enough of Cactus Jack in there that, you know, he didn't have to change a lot.
Right.
I think that's what you would have had. It was bringing him in as the Sultan, but he's coming in probably with the Sabu look, his pants, the headdress. It was all that Persian looking gimmick anyway, which almost makes a little bit of sense when you think about this idea of the Sultan. And when I always wondered what was the purpose of putting Fatu under that mask and into this gimmick of the Sultan. It never made sense to me. But I can see the sense of not wanting to call him Sabu coming into the company in 96, because this is when Vince was changing everyone's name. It was all about copyright. It was all about merchandising and copyright. So the Sultan would have been his WWF name, but he was still, I think he still would have been Sabu. It asks an interesting question. 1996 WWF, he's the Sultan with Sabu as the Sultan with his uncle as his manager.
Yeah.
He's got a mouthpiece. He's got a unique look. And 96 is a different kettle of fish, WWF, to the world we explored earlier of 93, 94. We're talking about a changing company.
I think that Sultan would have been awesome. I don't know how far it could have gone. I don't know if it would have been booked. I mean, I think the other thing too is, I think Vince could have trusted a guy like Eddie Farhat or the Sheik. I think he's, again, a business guy. He ran the big time promotion in Detroit, so he knows when if he's in the WWF with Sabu as the Sultan, he knows what sitting in Vince's seat is like. So he knows that he would not rock the boat by doing something wonky or off the wall, like, you know, stabbing forks and eyeballs and all that kind of stuff in 1996 WWF. That certainly would not have fly. Well, I mean, unless you were a fan of both that and ECW, and you would have chewed that shit up. But I feel like that's not what would have gone down. And if he had played ball and kind of pushed the envelope, but not quite so much. I mean, we already had Goldust, so I guess there's only so much envelope pushing you could have done. I think that maybe that gimmick would have worked. And then Sabu could have grown into something. And then you get to 97, Dave. And then, like Farouk wearing the fucking toilet bowl in his head or whatever, you kick that stuff out, and he becomes Sabu out of the Sultan.
Yeah, you could
when the
see
booking when the booking crew is like, all right, Vince, this gimmick is stupid. Just make him Sabu. This makes no sense.
But think about this. You bring him in probably, you know, so Fatu debuted in the gimmick in August of 1996. So if we assume that the plan was to start Sabu around that time, that July, August time period, bring him into the company. You don't have him at SummerSlam. That's August. But you bring him in as the Sultan character. I could picture him being that, having a partial alliance with Mankind, because this is the height of Mankind's feud with Undertaker, and then they meet at SummerSlam, but
Uh-huh.
then what's the next pay-per-view after SummerSlam in 1996? It's In Your House, Mind
Mind
Games
games in
in
Philly.
Philadelphia. So can you imagine Mankind's wrestling Shawn, and this is when they do they sort of tie do another match between Undertaker and Goldust, which really wasn't necessary. No, sorry. Yeah, I think it's a Goldust match, which wasn't really necessary. But can you imagine if you've just brought in the Sultan, Sabu as the Sultan, that imagine putting him against the Undertaker in Philadelphia.
Mm.
He
Oh
feels
wow.
that spot almost like, now he doesn't necessarily, he can lose by DQ. He can get himself disqualified, but I could see Sabu taking on that role, like in that post sort of back end of 96. Undertaker ended up with, there was sort of the offshoot feud from Mankind of the Executioner. Terry Gordy's come in and they did that, which that was an
You're right.
absolute bomb.
Yeah,
Now
it was.
imagine if that was Sabu, the Sultan,
Oh man.
against,
I mean,
in
pretty
this
awesome.
back end of 96. That it plays perfect, because with Foley, you've played into the mind game. You don't have to be a big guy to be able to be competitive with the Undertaker, because that was about the mind games. And now you could take it the next step. Here's Sabu. It's not necessarily the biggest guy, but this is the guy that will, like Mankind, put his body on the line, but he'll do it even more. Like he'll do it to a whole nother level to what Mankind was doing that. And
Right.
so now you've got a smaller guy who Undertaker can catch him off the ropes. He can do a moonsault and actually be caught, or he could be press slammed over the Undertaker's head through a table. Like you can play some of those big spots using a smaller Sabu. I think that would be a great way to bring him in as that Sultan gimmick. He can co-feud with the Undertaker at the back end of 96, linked in with Mankind, and then at the Royal Rumble you could have the two of them work together a little bit, like Mankind and um and Sabu are working together in that Rumble match. And I think it would really get the fans going and coming out of. I think it becomes a more organic team, that Mankind and Sabu end up being linked together. And so maybe your WrestleMania match isn't Owen and Davey versus Vader and Mankind, but it becomes Mankind and the Sultan. And then the Sultan, as Mankind starts to turn babyface, you've got the natural breaking apart of these two, and the Sultan. And I always seem to be able to bring it back to Sabu and Mick Foley here. I can bring it back together in any form possible, because I could just that becomes the great way to turn, as Foley starts turning babyface in 97. Who better to start it with than Sabu before you move on to the Triple H feud?
Right. That's true. Sure. Yeah, I could see that too. It's
And then
interesting because he would have taken a gimmick that ended up being a fucking joke, and by the guy who ended up getting it and making it into something completely different.
yeah, oh, he would have. And I think in that 97 time period, like when they're teaming together, when he and Mankind are teaming together, that's when you've got someone like Jim Ross saying he was known as Sabu before he came here.
Right.
They start to talk up that he's the Sultan, but people knew him as Sabu. And so, like you said, in that mid 97 time period, they can start to look at dropping the Sultan name. and tie it back into Sabu. And as because I think Sabu's style, as the growing attitude era became more tight, hard hitting, not quite the full extreme. I think Sabu fits quite well into that time period. The rise of Stone Cold. Imagine Stone Cold beating Sabu in a match on as part of his rise in '97 as he turns babyface and he beats Sabu on TV. Sabu, facing a Rock, facing a Farouk, facing these guys as they start to blur the lines of the babyface heel thing. Sabu would have been perfect for that.
Yeah, I agree. And then as we move on into 98, 99, maybe he becomes pretty valuable. As things become, as Vince kind of opens the pushes the envelope and opens up the creative aspect of things as obviously times change. Well, I think
again, the only thing that's going to be a detriment to him in 96, 97 is the talking aspect. Because,
like you said,
he wasn't a promo. You'd need to keep you'd have the Sheik there, but can you keep the Sheik there long term, or do you need to look at hooking him up with someone else?
Right, because that was not his strong suit, and unfortunately, Vince likes that stuff, and he likes guys that can kind of, he was obviously phasing out managers and stuff by 97. So except for the occasional valet, but I don't think Sabu would have fit with a Sonny. So I don't think that was going to fly.
Well, isn't Sabu one of the few people who rejected Sonny?
Yes.
Isn't that one of the stories?
Yeah. Well, in more ways than one, apparently. So I think eventually that would have been a detriment to him, is not being able to handle himself with a promo. Although, who knows? I mean, that might have changed too, but I doubt it, because I think the mystery of not talking was part of his allure. But unfortunately, with Vince, that kind of stuff only goes so far. So
I agree. Yeah.
Well, I think we did a pretty good job, Dave, of kind of navigating through the looking glass to various aspects of the late great Sabu, and what could have happened had he if business things went differently, or as you mentioned, the dark match in '93, if he had thrived in that, and if he had, if he was trustworthy enough in on both sides, and so we honor you, Sabu, and we tribute you, and you will be missed. One of the most unusual characters we've ever had in the history of pro wrestling, but thrived perfectly in a time in the 90s when a guy like him was right in the sensibility of the fans. So with that'll do it for this month's journey through the looking glass at the career of Sabu. Rest in peace. Dave, you can find all over the place. He obviously is here with me. He's also over on the No-So doing a lot of the Cronoso stuff. What are you guys doing right now?
We are a few days after this drops, we will have our SummerSlam 1990 episode dropping.
Oh,
so
there we go.
Yeah, we've worked our way through the summer of 1990, and now Cronoso is at SummerSlam. So find that that's going to be a cracker episode. So
yes, I agree. I agree.
Yeah, I unfortunately missed out on the demolition match, but but I got a nice little match. I'm not going to complain. I covered the Rockers versus Power and Glory match. So I think that's it's, if you can't get demolition versus the Hart Foundation, I think I ended up with one of the next best alternatives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yep. So enjoyed that over on the No-So. Of course, here we got great stuff. All of Luke Jennings' wonderful shows that play throughout the weekend through the early part of the week. This Friday, 2 days from now. Well, let's see. If this drops tomorrow, new episode of Nation Invasion with James Greeny Grunberg. Then on Friday, we've got a mega episode of Place to Be Nation's main event. Not only will we have our next main event archive, which is another late March episode of TNA, but it was a big weekend in current wrestling, Dave, this coming weekend, a Memorial Day weekend here in the States. We have TNA Under Siege. WWE has a Saturday night's main event. Then on Sunday, you have both TNA Battleground and AEW Double or Nothing. So we're going to preview all those shows, myself, Steve Willie, and Injurish. And then, of course, Main Event Archive. So a big episode of Main Event will drop it this coming Friday, just 2 days from now. And then all the usual stuff. And then over on the No-So, they do great previews and reviews of stuff. The PTB Pop Experience, the Backbone Network. So all the great stuff here throughout the quad of pods. And, of course, the Jenny Position. Well, can't forget her. Dave, always a pleasure. We'll be back with you in June with something. We're not telling you. July might be our next mailbag, though. We might get your questions ready, folks. I think July might be our next mailbag. So we might reach out to you for some of your questions about what ifs through the looking glass. If there's anything that interests you, we'd love to talk about it. So keep that in the back of your mind as you're listening to this episode, because coming up in late June, late next month, I may be reaching out to you on the Place to Be Facebook page and elsewhere for you to give us some of your questions that we could talk about on the July mailbag episode. So keep that in the back of your mind. Have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. Be safe here in the States. Parades and, cookouts and such as we officially get into summer. Dave, always a pleasure. Enjoy your winter. and say hi to the family, of course, as always. And have a great rest of the month, everybody. We will see you in June through the looking glass. Right.